Welcome back, Principal Matters podcast listeners. We're so excited to be back with you here today. I am with William D. Parker of Principal Matters, and we are going to welcome a really special guest today, David Yeager. But before that, we're going to do this fan favorite opening that really has begun to resonate with our listeners, hasn't it, Will?
It sure has.
Yeah. So
And
we have,
why don't you read the question, Jen, and we'll
yeah,
see if we can respond.
excellent. So here's the question that we're going to throw out into the universe, principals. Does anyone have any great ideas on how to help teachers keep their why in the forefront of their minds? This really is the question, Will, that is circulating a lot with our principals and our teachers too. So why don't you break it down for us and see, share any great ideas you might have on keeping the why in the forefront?
Yeah, I just hosted an amazing interview with a guest that listeners will hear in a few months from now. So I'm just going to give him a shout out, Derek Mitchell, who's the director or the CEO of Partners in School Innovation. And I asked him to tell me what motivated him to do this work because he works in a lot of very underserved schools. So he told me a story. And his story was so inspiring, Jen, that I got chills just listening to his own story as a young boy in a very underserved community, visiting a very affluent school for the first time and coming back and crying because of the difference he saw between where he was and where these other kids got to be. And that has driven him his whole life to want to provide kids. So I'm starting there because sometimes when I think about helping teachers rediscover their why, one way, and I'm not saying this is the only way, but one way I found that is to just bring them back to stories. The stories of a student who's been changed by their work, or the story of a colleague who's been changed by this work. And so I don't know about you, but I have a good friend, a past colleague named Pat James. He was a coach and a principal. And at the end of our staff meetings, a lot of times Pat would end the staff meeting with a story. And usually, because Pat was just really good at this, he would find an inspiring story about a kid who'd been changed by school, and he would tell it. And I would look at the faces of the teachers, some of my veterans who were often, for lack of a better word, the most challenging, and I would see them soften and sometimes just break into tears because he was reminding them of their why. So I that's just one way. What thoughts do you have?
Well, I'm sitting there listening to you and agreeing with everything that you're saying. And I keep going back to previous episodes we've done about purpose. I think it's a really complex question because it can be so multi-layered and it can change. Um, it can be, it's okay for your why to be something that isn't necessarily popular to say. um, I think about teachers who have said, it's a really good job and it fits that of my family and my children. And it's easy to scoff at that answer, but I think it's fair. And I think it's okay. Just so the daily give back is there for students, if that ends up being the purpose. Um, I was working with a group of educators last year actually, and they said, "Oh my God, we are so sick of being asked our why. I know my why. I'm here. I'm doing it. I feel good about it." And that question can really start to feel kind of condescending. And I think that's fair too. And I think we have to acknowledge it. And I've started to use different words. I've started to say, okay, what's your purpose? What's your intended outcome? What's feeling really good right now? What is it that's really bringing you down? When you go home at night and you're like, I'm quitting this stupid job. Why is that? So I really want to be cautious that this question, what's your why, doesn't become laden with condescension and despair, but more becomes a barometer for why we do what we do.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Okay, I've just got to be the English teacher for a minute because, and maybe it's just because my brain is wired the way that it is. There's nothing worse than a movie or a book that just starts telling you the whole purpose of why the story's being
Right.
told. There's nothing
Right.
worse than that. But the best movies, the best stories are the ones where you get pulled in and then throughout that experience you discover the reason. And so you're right, Jen, asking teachers to just there's there's a better way than just saying we're going to talk today about our why.
Right.
Let's think about the creative ways that we can help. So I'm not sure if our response has been helpful. But I would say this, your students are always your why. So look for creative ways to pull kids back into conversations. I remember one year when I was a creative writing teacher, I had this boy in my class who just was so gifted. He could write poetry that was so beautiful. And he wrote a poem about teachers one day, and it was just so touching. I was like, would you read this to the staff? And I didn't, so I went and got permission to bring him to the next staff meeting. But you talk about getting reminded about your why when students can remind you of their why. So there's a lot of ways you can bring people back to the reason without having to just say, let's talk about the why.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
All right, Jen. Well, I know Principal Matters listeners, you're going to love this conversation today with David Yeager, whose book that I'm going to be recommending in this conversation is one you're going to want to go out and buy. I've already predicted that David Yeager is probably going to be on everyone's conference lists. Jen, this is going to be an amazing conversation about his book, 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. So stay tuned. But until next time, thank you for doing what matters. And if you want to reach out to either Jen or me for our resources, you can find mine at my website at williamdparker.com. And Jen, how
And
can they find you?
they can find me at jenschwanke.com.
Thanks, Jen. Principal Matters Podcast, episode 420. Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast, where each week we bring you inspiring, innovative, and imaginative ideas for your own school leadership. And this week, we're going to be talking about mentoring mindset with my special guest, Dr. David Yeager. David Yeager is a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin and the co-founder of the Texas Behavioral Science and Policy Institute. He's best known for his research conducted with Carol Dweck, Angela Duckworth, and Greg Walton on short but powerful interventions that influence adolescent behaviors. He's consulted for Google and Microsoft, Disney, and the World Bank, as well as for the White House and governments in California, Texas, and Norway. His research has been featured in the New York Times Magazine, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Scientific American, CNN, Fox News, The Guardian, Atlantic, and more. He is considered among the 0.1% most influential psychologists in the world over the past decade. And before his career as a scientist, he was a middle school teacher and a basketball coach. And he earned his PhD and master's at Stanford University and his BA and his master's in education at the University of Notre Dame. He lives in Austin with his wife and 4 children, and he's the author of the best-selling book, 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. David Yeager, I know that's a long intro, but I want to make sure my listeners know who you are. And I always like to ask, can you please fill in the gaps on that intro and tell some listeners something else they may be surprised to know about you?
Yeah, you could keep going. I'm happy with that. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say I was a basketball coach and now I'm a baseball coach. So now I spend 5 days a week coaching 8 to 12-year-olds hitting and pitching. So
I'm going to guess you probably have a kid in that mix.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we have 4 kids. So
yeah.
I got, my reward for caring is to coach all the children in the neighborhood.
More power to you, my friend. So let me tell listeners a little context here, because I love to give credit where credit's due. I love to listen to Guy Kawasaki's podcast, Remarkable People, and he featured you on that podcast in your wonderful book, 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. I just happened at the same time, for what it's worth, I'm in Oklahoma, you're in Texas. I was in Palo Alto working with a school when I was listening to that podcast, because you'd been at Stanford and you are a huge piece of, I know Carol Dweck is a huge piece of your history and I love her work. And I was in the office of the principal of Palo Alto High School, a friend of mine named Brent Klein, and he held up this book and said, have you got a copy of this yet? And I said, yes, because I just ordered it this morning. And so we have been talking about you for a long time, and I reached out. You were so generous to say yes to this invitation. And I want to start here. So you personally have done so much research, and there's no way in this conversation we're going to be able to delve into all of the different ways you've studied adolescent behavior. But in addition to your own research, I loved how you took decades of other research and you've taken these what we've all been aware of as educators that have been research around management, parenting, education, but you've been able to take them and shape them into a very comprehensive approach that you called the mentor mindset. So I wanted to start there. Can you explain how you were able to take that exhaustive, all those decades of research plus your own, and kind of shape it into um, this approach for how to work with adolescents?
Yeah, and that's great. And by the way, I taught in Tulsa, Oklahoma, so I loved living in Oklahoma. Um, the so for a long time, Carol Dweck and I were doing research on kids' mindsets and young adults' mindsets about their own potential and abilities. And the big idea, obviously, is, if you believe that failure now means you're always going to be a failure, you're no good, that kind of fixed mindset thinking, that's a big problem. And if you instead believe that, mistakes are the route to growing, then that's better. It's more to it than that, but that's the simple version. And what we found in our experiments after, I don't know, 10, 12 years was that if you gave a kid a growth mindset, let's say in the first week of high school, um, you could, on average, improve their academic outcomes. Like they would do a little better in school, they would take harder classes, et cetera, but only if the classroom context supported a growth mindset. Mm. And we found, for instance, about 30 to 40% of teachers believed more of a fixed mindset. And in those classrooms, the kids might get our treatment and say, yeah, I'm ready to grow my brain, but then look at how the teacher's running the class and say, actually, this doesn't apply here. So about 5 or 6 years ago, Carol and I and others, we collaborate with a lot of people, started getting obsessed with the question of what the adults are doing. And what we found is that, yes, the teacher's mindset matters, but it's a little more than just whether the teacher thinks the kid can grow, in part because there are open questions about how a kid could grow. And some people think, yeah, sure, you could grow your abilities. You could get smarter in math if I give you an endless stream of like super demanding assignments and make you go do them on your own. And you have to be independent and autonomous and responsible for yourself. Then you could grow. But we call that an enforcer mindset, that I'm just enforcing a ridiculously high standard, but not helping you actually meet it. So that might come from a place of helping a kid grow, but it's not, to the kid, it doesn't feel like growth mindset because it feels like they're being asked to do something impossible and not helped to do it. Another potentially problematic way to think a kid could grow is by giving them tiny, tiny steps where they could gradually build up confidence and removing high demands to do realistic work and instead allowing them to have tiny success experiences that allow them to gradually increase their ambition. And that makes perfectly good sense. I understand where that's coming from, but that also is not really a good way for kids to grow. And you end up in what I call a protector mindset. And that's more the idea that I'm trying to protect you from failure, disappointment, distress, so that you don't lose your confidence. Mm. And that ends up also not feeling like a growth mindset to students because they are like, well, the teacher has very low expectations for me. They must think I'm dumb. And if they think I'm dumb, then this isn't a place I can grow. And so we kind of looked at those two conventional mistakes and without judgment, just describe them. I understand where they come from. I'm not saying those are bad people, but we realized there's a third way, which is to have very high standards and very high support. And in parallel to that kind of logical reasoning, we went out and found the greatest growth mindset teachers and we followed them for years. So Carol Dweck and I called this guy Sergio Estrada that I write about in the book every Friday for like 3 years. And he's this amazing physics teacher in El Paso, Texas. For 2 years, I sat in on the calculus class for UT Austin, where I teach, our best calculus instructor named Uri Treisman, who's a legend in the field. And all of them had surprisingly very high standards. Like kids cried in their class because it was super duper hard, but they were supportive so that 95 to 100% of kids would meet those standards in the class. So they weren't just enforcing impossible standards and they weren't protecting kids from distress. It was like very hard, sometimes emotionally stressful, but they were supported. And that's what I decided to write the book about, is that combination of high standards, high support.
Well, that was such a great summary. Thank you, David. So enforcers have high standards, low support. Protectors have high supports, low standards. Mentors have high standards and high support. And I just have to say, knowing that you were a middle school teacher, now turned professor, while reading your book, it just having that lens, knowing that you've not only been in the trenches of what it feels like to step into classroom settings, but now you have studied carefully and scientifically what great classrooms look like across the U.S. And you have so many examples in the book, so kudos for that. I love it that you're landing in that place that all of us know. All of us know from experience, the teachers who have shaped us the most are the ones that have that balance between standards and support. For this is not a very good scientific example, but it's a visual that I like to keep in mind myself, which is the science around left brain, right brain, which is not completely accurate research, but it helps me to kind of think about one side of my brain being that super creative piece and one side being the very analytical. And I think about great teachers doing the same thing all the time too. They know that balance between process, procedure, and routine and sequence on the one side, and then creativity and wonder and inspiration and leading kids to discovery on the other. And I love it. I love how you've taken that tension. So let's talk about brain science for just a minute, because you do something in the book that when I was reading this, I just thought, I want to ask you to unpack this a little bit more, because you push back against some of the misapplications. And there's a lot of misapplications in brain science and child development. But specifically, you talk about how the prefrontal regions of our brain, the emotional part, actually act as the teachers, while the frontal regions, those reasoning pieces, act as the students when it comes to adolescence. And that's not really the way most people think about child development when they're thinking about the way brains work in kids. So talk about why that was an important thing for you to explain to your readers.
Yeah, and just to clarify, it's that the emotional or limbic regions are the teacher and the prefrontal is the student.
Thank you.
The conventional view, going back thousands of years, even before they understood the brain, is that there are the passions, and the passions are unruly, and they need to be governed and controlled by the kind of abstract reasoning, logical, deductive planning parts of the mind, or now we think of it as the brain. And that goes back, you can see this in Plato and Aristotle, and then that shows up again in a lot of neuroscience in the 1990s, early 2000s. And the reason why that became an appealing argument is for a very good reason, which was to prevent juvenile offenders who committed violent crimes from going to prison for life. So neuroscientists argued successfully to the Supreme Court that basically young people are not fully in control of their brains, and therefore but later in life they will have more control when their brains are fully developed, and therefore they shouldn't be held to an adult-like standard because they have childlike brains. It's kind of the argument. And that was a very noble social justice thing to do, and those neuroscientists should be lauded for improving the quality of our justice system. The problem is that argument taken to its logical extreme is that you really can't trust the judgment or decision making of any young person. And then you say, well, maybe they shouldn't have choices like about their own like bodies or reproduction or who they're friends with or what they wear or whether they can use phones or where they go to college, or you can just start taking that argument all those different directions. and the broad model is something that I have labeled the neurobiological incompetence model, that the teenage brain is fundamentally broken because it's immature and the prefrontal regions can't control the passions. There's an alternative view, though, which is that the prefrontal regions of the brain are for goal-directed behavior. And this is how Adriana Galvan, who I interview in the book, is a good friend, professor at UCLA. This is how she characterizes this information. And she's like, look, when you're planning something, you're planning to meet a goal, whether that's to feel better or to not feel bad. And goals have at their heart the emotions and affect, right? Goals aren't purely logical. There's a feeling involved. Like you want to feel a certain way or not feel a certain bad way. And so you can think of the prefrontal regions as the students that are responding to the environment to help you figure out how to feel the way you want to feel. Now, how do young people want to feel? They, in general, they want to feel a sense of social success and competence. So we call it status and respect in the book. And we know from really, you can look at animal studies. I had to cut this from the book, but I had hundreds of pages on hamster studies, and like, you don't want to know how they know about the gonads and how they influence the brain. Like, you don't want to. This is like when I tell that stuff in my undergrad class, it's like a stand-up bit. But we'll save those gruesome details for another day. But in general, once gonadal maturation happens, which of course causes increases in testosterone, estradiol in both males and females, the brain gets sensitized to reward and punishment a little more, but specifically social reward and punishment. And so that kind of limbic desire is then causing the prefrontal regions to like figure out how to feel more socially successful and avoid things like humiliation. And what I often say is like, look, on any given day when you're interacting with a teenager, that is the day on which they have the most testosterone they have ever had in their entire lives. And so they're going to be really attuned to status and respect, and they're going to read between the lines in how you talk to them, and they're going to pay attention to who's looking down on them. And then the next day when you see them, that will then be the day on which they had the most testosterone they've ever had in their entire lives, right? And so, like, of course that's going to affect the prefrontal regions because it's trying to like figure out the goals. And of course it's going to then teach the hippocampus what to remember. And you can in general think about how some feeling of unexpected pride, like someone who admired you when they're impossible to impress, that never feels as good as it does in adolescence. And that feeling of like surprising humiliation, or like unjust accusations, that never feels as bad as it does in adolescence. And that's because the emotion regions are teaching the memory and the prefrontal regions how to like never feel that way again. And so it's adaptive for them to be hyper attuned and hyper memory focused about social experiences. It doesn't mean their brains are idiotic. It means they're going to be more responsive to the environment than older people who are more secure in their status.
Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, and then we'll be right back. Everyone talks about the power of data-driven instruction, but how do you actually get the right insights and know the best next steps? The secret is IXL. IXL helps you easily assess performance and determines the best path forward for each student. Whether you need data for benchmarking or intervention planning, IXL can do it all. And IXL doesn't stop at assessments. It also provides you with everything else your school needs, from a standards-aligned K-12 curriculum to actionable analytics. IXL's online learning and teaching platform is research proven to improve student outcomes and is used by 95 of the top 100 U.S. school districts. If you also want to start driving real progress, get started today at IXL.com/PM. Support for Principal Matters comes from EduSkills. Let's face it, many schools are trying to support their Title III and multilingual programs on their own. And if that's you, it's time to take your support to the next level with EduSkills. EduSkills is designed by former educators as a go-to platform for support for K-12 multilingual programs. They understand the value of multilingual students, and they give educators the tools that they need to help all students succeed. From improving language acquisition to boosting family engagement, EduSkills offers cutting-edge tech and services for districts of all sizes. With easy setup and ongoing support, they'll make sure your transition is smooth and effective and that more students are receiving better services. Ready to get started? Visit eduskillsllc.com or call 405-879-9898 to schedule a demo. EduSkills, breaking barriers, and building bridges for multilingual education. So what I love about, David, your perspective is it reminds educators, because occasionally you'll hear people say this in settings, teachers, when they're having conversations about kids or middle schoolers or high schoolers, that they'll say things like, well, that their brains aren't fully developed, or they're brain damaged, or they kind of this neurological dysfunction that you have, that we need to tell them what to do because they can't make those rational decisions on your own. What you're saying instead is, listen, tap into this already biological and neurological truth that status and respect and social reward are driving the way that they rationalize and plan and reason. They are capable and very skilled at rational work. But as a person shaping and trying to lead and mentor youth, how do you leverage the truth that no, these are actually this is a present reality that you need to figure out how to use to your advantage. So this is where I would really like for you to take a couple of minutes and talk about some of the approaches that you discuss in the book. And you can go whatever direction you want to with this, because you give a lot of really great practical examples. The 4 principles for respectful instructions, your transparency statements, even the conversations you have with your own children. And so you take this whatever direction you want to, David, but how would you apply that knowledge in real life?
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, you're right. I tried hard to like have lots of concrete information in the book. I mean, I wanted to have the kind of book where you get to chapter 9 and you can't believe that we're still introducing new stuff. Like, I'm not repeating the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's what I was trying to do. And I actually do hope you read chapter 9 because it's one of my favorites. But the example that I think works really well is our work on healthy eating. So this is with my colleague Chris Bryan and Cynthia Hinojosa, and this is a project in which we had to figure out how to get middle schoolers to choose to eat healthy food rather than junk food in the lunchroom. And before you even think about that problem, like, what does society think is the answer to it? And of course, they think it's like health class, where, Michelle Obama, bless her heart, was giving everyone like the food pyramid, and like, you should eat this, you should eat that. But like, telling kids to eat their broccoli, I mean, is like the stereotype of bad behavior change for adolescents. And the conventional approach amounts to what I call in the book grown-splaining, which is where adults say, like, if only I can explain the contents of my logical reasoning brain to you, idiotic, short-sighted teenager, then you would see the world the way I do and you would listen to me. And we think that just more explaining is going to fix the problem. And that's not the case, because on the one hand, the more we explain stuff, the more we're implying that they're idiots, which will offend them. And second, like, they kind of need to have agency and ownership if they're the ones that have to make the choices. But it also, like, grown-splaining isn't attuned to why young people want to do the behavior that we think is bad. So just take in the case of eating junk food, right? Imagine a kid going to the lunchroom and everyone else is eating like Nutella and Coke and pizza. And you're like, I'm going to have the kale, the water, and extra salad on the side. Like, and then you plop your plate down in front of all your friends. They're going to think you're a lunatic. Like, with that, unless there's more context for that behavior. And we realized that the default construal of healthy eating is you're a lame nerd who does what grown-ups say. And therefore, in order to eat healthy, you have to sacrifice status and respect. You have to look like a social weirdo in front of people whose opinions you care about. And so rather than try to get them to care about something else, like care more about long-term health than social fit right now, instead, the idea is to align the healthy behavior with what counts for being socially successful right now. We call this values alignment. And so, like, what are the values that young people have? It's not just to eat unhealthy. Like, that's not really a value. It just feels more normal. A value they have is being independent and autonomous and standing up for others, like addressing injustice, calling out adults who are ruining the world. And so in our intervention, we didn't mention anything about the food pyramid or the health benefits of eating healthy. We instead said, look, do you know why junk food is so delicious and why everybody eats it? It's because the food companies hired a bunch of tobacco executives when they could no longer sell cigarettes to children, decided to get children in poor communities addicted to Frosted Flakes and hot Cheetos. And then they hired scientists who experimented with every possible way of having hot Cheetos be crunchy and melty and spicy or whatever. And they chose the one that was most addictive for children like you. And then they created cartoons, and then they sell it at every corner store. And meanwhile, they tried to crowd out grocery stores that sell healthy food. And then by the way, these former tobacco executives don't let their own children and grandchildren eat this food because they know it's bad for them. So they're also hypocrites. And so if you want to stand up to these people that are exploiting you, then every time you make a healthy choice, you're taking money out of the pocket of these hypocrites. And then it's like awesome to eat healthy. And what we found is we could do this message in like 25 minutes. And then sometimes we come back a second day and we let them draw graffiti on junk food ads. And they kind of sarcastically, take down the food companies. And then working with the school, we tracked what students purchased by tracking their ID cards in the lunchroom over the next 3 months. And we find that they make fewer junk food purchases and more health food purchases with no booster, no reminder. There's no like food pyramid ramming down their throat. It's just that the good behavior is aligned with what counts for status and respect in the eyes of their peers. And that general principle of values alignment, of like figure out what counts for respect and then align the good behavior with that, is almost always going to work better than grown-splaining.
I love this. I know that we're limited on the amount of time that we have to wrap this up, David. So I want to, Dr. Yeager. So I want to throw you a curveball. Not because I'm trying to put you on the spot, but because this was.
Well, I'm a baseball coach, so.
Yeah, this is one of my
ready for
favorite
it.
parts in the book was when so I want to do another application because that was such a great application of how um, moving away from grown splaining to really giving kids an understanding of the motivations and incentives and duplicity involved in big food corporations trying to deceive them into what to eat suddenly changed the way they ate. So you appeal to that social status, respect, that part of that emotional part of them to lead them to a more rational decision. So I love that example. You've also had to experience this in parenting. And so one of the parts of the book that made me to laugh the most was the conversation that you give with your son that you call Jack Jack. And so I didn't know if you would mind, I'm going to go off script and just ask you, how have you learned to apply this same approach to, even when you're having conversations with your own children, of how to frame those conversations in a way that kind of leads towards solution and away from um, being stuck in emotion.
Yeah, I'd say that I wrote a lot about parenting in the book in part because I wanted to become a better parent. And so I interviewed this parenting coach who's amazing. Her name is Lorena Seidel. We're taping a masterclass next week for that website masterclass. And Lorena is going to be one of the guests on it. And I'll tell you what, I interviewed her more than I needed for the book because I just wanted more parenting advice. And one of the things that she really impressed upon me is the power of asking questions rather than just telling. So like the conventional thing is like kids flipping out, they're freaking out over nothing and it's pointless and now everybody's late. Mm-hmm. The temptation is to grown-splain in that moment, right? Like you're making everybody late. You're being really selfish. This is totally out of control. You need to grow up. You need to be more responsible. This is a problem. Like, let's go get your shoes on, get in the car. Like that feels natural to me and most parents probably. But she'll like ask questions. She'll be like, all right, I see you're really upset about something. Can you just tell me a little bit more about that so I can understand it? And then she'll explain. She'll say, because I don't want to tell you what to do until I understand where you're coming from, because that's not respectful of you. Now that stuff's hard to do when your kid is like literally sabotaging your entire plans for the day and you're in a rush. But I've started doing that more. And then on times, then you start troubleshooting. And it turns out that all they wanted was to be heard to begin with. Mm-hmm. And then they come up with their own solutions to the problem. And then they become more independent and you save yourself time in the future. So even though it's like, feels like the world's on fire, I don't have time to ask a bunch of open-ended questions to this recalcitrant jerk kid. Like, if you do it, they become more independent and do better later. But the other point is like, you're going to screw up. And so I love this second thing I learned from Lorena, which is the do-over. And sometimes you can start an enforcer and you're like, ah, that was awful, didn't go well. And you can say, you can go back to the kid and be like, look, I didn't live up to my goals for how I want to interact with you. I didn't really live our family values. I'm really sorry about that. And I'm happy to debrief it. But in general, what I should have done was figured out what you needed right now. So that way we can move on with our day. So can you just tell me a little bit more about what you were going for and what your issues were? But not in an accusatory or rushed tone. And it turns out that they remember the do-over more than they remember the first part. And I think a lot of parents worry that they're going to blow up and screw up their kid and cause toxic stress that's going to give them an attachment disorder, and they'll never fall in love and they'll die alone. Like, that's most parents' heads go there when they screw up. But it turns out they can have a do-over, and you can do it better the second time.
Well, Principal Matters listeners, the book is 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People, a groundbreaking approach to leading the next generation and making your own life easier. And Dr. Yeager, I just have to say this as we wrap up, and I ask you one last question, but and there's so many things I wanted to ask you that I'm not going to get time to do. Like, so I'm just going to throw this out there for listeners who need to read this book. Like, you take the movie Stand and Deliver, which has just been, a hallmark of every educator forever, and you unpack the fallacies involved in that movie, and also show how, if you apply the research you've done to the way that the real characters in that movie actually taught those students, that there's an even better result possible for you in education. So kudos on your great work. I think this is a book that is not only great for educators, it's great for parents, it's great for business owners, it's great for people in general. And so I just want to just applaud you on the amazing research, communication. This is definitely going to be a go-to that I have for the people that I work with. And I just want to encourage listeners to go online today and look up 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People by Dr. David Yeager, and get a copy. As we wrap up, I wanted to give you an opportunity just to share any other thoughts or ideas that you would like listeners to be aware of. And then how can people connect with you if they want to reach out to you or find out more about your work?
Oh yeah, well, I'm just a nerd professor, so I have like LinkedIn and a professor email. So that's all I have. I don't have time to be on TikTok or whatever.
We'll put it in
But
the show notes.
I would say that, the high level reason why I wrote the book is I want people to have a sense of hope and optimism for young people, but rooted in reality. Because yeah, I mean, most educators are hopeful and optimistic. That's why we do what we do. We're in the business of changing young people's lives. So you have to have hope for the future to do it. But oftentimes that hope feels foolish because we see so many examples of it not getting better. And I wanted to find the teachers, professors, managers, parents where they actually figured it out and find their secrets and then share it with everybody, and also understand why it's sometimes hard to be those exemplary people, so that if you're struggling on whatever part of your journey, the book is still for you. Like, I didn't want to write a book that's the equivalent of a diet book that's like, all right, just get rid of all sugars, right? And stop drinking and never eat dessert. Like, that's not helpful because those things are hard to do. So it needed to have the human stories of how to actually change and why it's reasonable to be stuck sometimes. And so I hope that by telling those stories and finding these exemplary people, that anyone can have a sense of hope and optimism for the next generation and see a role that they can play in those young people's lives.
Well, David, thank you so much for the opportunity to introduce you to Principal Matters listeners. And Principal Matters listeners, I just want to encourage you, as you're stepping into whatever season that you're in right now with your students and your schools and your communities, and leading at the levels that you're at, that so much of what I have seen great educators do, that when you observe them and you're like, wow, this works. David, you've just captured, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of examples of schools across the U.S. that have been doing this and are doing this, and educators who are really good examples of this mentor mindset and why it works scientifically, and but also why it works relationally. And so, thank you for what you've provided to the world in your research and in your teaching. And Principal Matters listeners, thank you for doing what matters. We'll talk to you again next week. You'll find free resources like this one at williamdparker.com. Subscribe for our free weekly newsletter, which contains bonus material, and also check out the links for Grow Academies, Masterminds, Executive Coaching, and Keynote presentations from my books, as well as from Principal Matters Associates. You can find out more under our speakers tab at williamdparker.com. Thank you for learning together, and thank you for doing what matters.